Hello, everyone. We're going to do a little presentation on the basics of climate justice. My name's Indigo. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a junior in high school. And then I'll let Natasha go next.
Hi, I'm Natasha. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm also a junior.
Hello, I'm Sophia. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm also a junior. So we're going to delve right into our presentation just to give some information about climate justice. Because personally, I didn't learn about it until I joined YA. So the organization that we're a part of is Youth Environmental Activists of Minnesota, which is a program of climate generation. And since that's pretty wordy, we call ourselves YA for short. And we'll put a link for you to learn more about our group in the description. And we're also going to start with a land acknowledgement to acknowledge the history of the land that we are on and how we can move forward, keeping history in mind. So we would like to take time to recognize whose land we are on today. As we are all throughout Minnesota, we will generally recognize the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Dakota, Ho-Chunk, and Anishinaabe. We acknowledge this because of the effects of colonization and genocide that shape the everyday experiences of Indigenous individuals and communities. And those communities are alive, resilient, and leading change, especially for climate justice in our world. So before you can really understand climate justice, you have to understand climate change. And I think most people have an understanding of what climate change is, but I just wanted to give a brief overview before we delve in. So climate change isn't just a temporary fluctuation in weather. It's a change in the patterns over time in temperature and precipitation. And the cause of climate change is due to human activity that creates global warming. And obviously this has many negative effects on people and animals and the planet. So there are just a few listed here: flooding, drought, crop failure, melting ice caps, more hurricanes and tropical storms, rising sea levels, more wildfires and heat waves, and worse mental health. And one question for you to think about is, which groups of people do you think are the most affected by climate change? And feel free to put your thoughts in the comments to have a little discussion. So this is just a graph that NASA came out with just to show how the temperatures are rising over time due to human-caused global warming. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of climate change, we can start talking about climate justice. So climate justice is working towards a future that is sustainable and also equitable, because the systems of climate change are also connected to the systems of racism and oppression that exist in our society. For example, the BIPOC community and people with disabilities and people with lower incomes are affected more by the climate crisis because they don't generally have as many resources to be able to deal with the effects. And so because those groups are the most affected, they should be the ones that are prioritized when it comes to climate solutions. And one more note about climate justice is that it does require systemic change. And systemic change means changing the patterns that have existed in our world throughout history. So it's more than just one action. It requires kind of a reframing of our world. And here I included a picture. You may or may not have seen it before, but it helps me understand the difference between equality and equity. So equality is giving everyone the same treatment regardless, but equity is giving people treatment based on what they need. And so feel free to think about this picture and what it means to you. And also feel free to put in the comments how you would explain the difference between equality and equity. Because when it comes to climate justice, we really want to focus on equity to make sure that people who need the most are getting the most, which is not always been the case in history. And with that, I'm gonna pass it off to Indigo, who is gonna give some examples of climate injustice.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia, for that great explanation of the effects of climate change and an introduction to climate justice. I'm going to start by kind of going through several examples of like incidences that I would call like climate injustices that kind of showcase the intersections between the effects of climate change and the things that cause climate change, and also other forms of systemic oppression like racism and mainly classism in these slides, and colonization. So I'm going to start with the slide that I title A Web of Oppression, because it kind of shows how I feel like knit together everything is. So let's start. JBS is one of the largest meat processors in the world. And they have a pork processing plant in Worthington, Minnesota, which is a small town in southern Minnesota. So this is a plant that employs a lot of people of color. And when COVID first hit last year, JBS was really slow to shut down all their plants, but particularly this plant. And this resulted in hundreds of workers getting coronavirus and getting sick. So 87% of the people who got sick were people of color. And something else to note about JBS is that this is a company that sources most of its meat from farms that are destroying and deforesting the Amazon, like the Amazon rainforest in, Southern America. And so it's kind of, I think that these kind of two kind of horrific facts show that companies that source their meat from farms that destroy the environment also tend not to care for human lives and, probably will put their workers in harm's way. And I think this also shows that like there's a larger system at play that harms humans as well as the environment. And by not caring for the environment, we're harming humans. And by not caring for humans, we're harming the environment, if that kind of makes sense. So this kind of all leads back to we can't ignore racism, sexism, xenophobia, classism, etc., as the companies and corporations promoting these harmful beliefs are usually also destroying the environment. And so by taking care of each other, we're also caring for the earth and the environment. And I think that's a core tenet to climate justice, is that we have to take care of each other to take care of the environment. And I think that's like sometimes a sentiment lost in like, sometimes when you think of environmentalism, we think of it purely as the environment, completely separate from humans, but, in the real world, that's not quite so clean cut. And so now I'm kind of going to move on to a more historical example through like the destruction of the Minnesota prairie and the extermination of the bison and colonization, which are all kind of tied together as well. So I'm going to start by kind of explaining why bison are so important to the prairie ecosystem. So basically, bison are really important to a healthy prairie ecosystem. They live a lot in symbiosis with the like prairie plants. So like they help the plants of the prairie, and the plants of the prairie help them. That's kind of like a symbiotic relationship. So like some examples of like their significance in this symbiotic relationship is, so their pee acts as fertilizer to plants. It's like really good. And their storming across their plains ensures that dirt is packed down, making sure that, the wind can't just blow dirt and seeds everywhere, and making sure that plants have enough like stability to grow. And actually the Great Dust Bowl, which was like this time, it was happened in the early 1900s, and it caused mass famine across the US, was probably caused because of the lack of bison, not stomping down on the prairie soil. Okay, there's fur also spread seeds, and et cetera, et cetera. So basically, indigenous people who lived in this region depended on buffalo for food and supplies, and they also had kind of a control of the buffalo, like they could herd them to different places, and they had kind of a symbiotic relationship with the bison and with the prairie, and sustained a very healthy ecosystem for centuries before colonization. So the US government, when they wanted to gain control of this land, to establish Minnesota and Minneapolis, they encouraged soldiers and hunters to kill as much buffalo as they could. So these hunters and soldiers killed hundreds of thousands of bison. And as a response to these hunters/soldiers, William T. Sherman, who you may have heard about in a Civil War history class, he was a really prominent general for the northern side, actually said, these men have done more in the last 2 years and will do more in the next year to settle the vexed Indian question, which I think really shows what the motivations of the US government were for trying to take out all these bison. And to kind of explain this picture you see on the left, it's basically two men, one at the bottom and one at the top, standing on basically like a mountain of bison skulls. I know it's kind of blurry, but yeah, all of those kind of little white spots are the skulls of bison. And this kind of another kind of horrific story shows that a strategy of the US colonization was destroying the environment, and being decolonized is an important part of fighting climate change, because colonization does depend on the destruction of the environment and kind of the distancing between people and the environment, if that makes sense. Like colonization kind of makes sure that we view profit over protecting the environment. Okay, so this kind of example continues with Line 3 today, which is a pipeline currently being built in northern Minnesota. And it's kind of a continuation of land theft that's been happening for hundreds of years in the US, and I'm kind of going to get into it. So basically, I'm going to start by explaining where Line 3 is going. So it's going to go through 2 reservations and through land that is legally reserved for Ojibwe people. And this land holds some of the largest wild rice beds in the world and is legally bound to Ojibwe for hunting, fishing ceremonies, gathering plants and medicine, and travel. Line 3 is also really bad for the environment. It pumps out a lot more oil than currently is going through the pipeline that is there. So it increases oil supply by as much as 50 coal plants, which is a lot. And as scientists have said, we can't keep using, basically there was a new science report that said, if we want to stay under like the 1.5 degree, like if we don't want to increase the global temperature by 1.5 degrees, we can't build any new fossil fuel infrastructure. And Line 3 is new fossil fuel infrastructure. But basically, this all kind of connects to treaty rights, because in 1855, the Ojibwe signed a treaty with the US government, which provided a lot of the land for Minnesota. And in that treaty, Ojibwe people, negotiated really hard and assured that the health of the land of giant swaths of Minnesota, including the land that Line 3 is being put into, would be retained as, healthy and clean and would remain able to be hunted on and fished on, and, plants would continue to grow and they would continue to harvest medicines and food and practice, do spiritual practices. So by putting Line 3 in, the U.S. because the U.S. is allowing this pipeline to be put in, we are, breaking treaties, which has happened for centuries as well, and is what led to a lot of the land in the U.S. becoming U.S. territory. So also, what kind of adds insult to injury is that Enbridge, which is the company putting the pipeline in, it's a Canadian company, has had some of the worst oil spills in the country. It had actually the largest inland oil spill in all of the US, and it was actually in this area in northern Minnesota, and kind of this shows that Line 3 will probably break and will probably leak. Damaging the land and also, breaking treaty rights. And kind of this just shows how colonization does kind of continue to this day, or at least remnants of it do. Yeah. So after that, really, these kind of three really depressing stories, I'm kind of going to move on to a very much more positive spin, which is continued Indigenous resistance. So as I've, talked a lot about Line 3, this also goes hand in hand with Indigenous resistance. And so basically, Indigenous people have been fighting colonization since colonization started. And this continues to today. So the main people fighting against pipelines across the US are primarily Indigenous women. So on the bottom right, you see Tara Huska, who is the leader of GNU Collective, which is a really big organization of Indigenous people fighting Line 3 on the front lines and through the courts. On the top, you see also a picture of a GNU protest on the front lines. So in the background, you can kind of see, some construction machines that are working to put in the pipeline, and they're trying to, prevent that from happening through protest. So basically, right now in Minnesota, the main groups that have started the fight against Line 3, which was started about 5 years ago when this plan was implemented, were Indigenous groups, and continue to this day to be Indigenous groups fighting on the front lines, which just means that they are at the construction sites of the pipeline, protesting it and trying to prevent work from being done. And kind of this also, this isn't just a local thing. Indigenous people across the globe are protecting the environment and resisting colonization. So this is a fact from National Geographic, which is even though less than 5% of the world population is Indigenous people are protecting about 80% of the world's biodiversity. And so I kind of think that's a fact you can kind of think on, and just kind of shows you how impactful Indigenous resistance is, and just, all kind of resistance to colonization. Sorry, I just kind of had a burp. But I'm kind of now going to list some of the main groups that are organizing against Line 3 and pipelines in general. So these are Honor the Earth, GNU Collective, Camp McGeezy, and RISE. These are really great organizations if you want to learn more about this movement. And now I'll pass it to Natasha to talk sorry. First, there's some discussion questions. Where have you learned about climate injustice? And what could be done to correct these injustices? So you can, put your answers in the comments, or, talk to some of your friends about this, or just, think about it for a couple of days. And okay, now I'm going to pass it to Natasha to talk about a lot more solutions to climate change and, that incorporate climate justice.
Yeah, thanks, Indigo. So I'm going to show you some examples of some climate solutions in our own community. So I am guessing you have probably learned about some like solitary solutions such as recycling, having a plant-based diet, or using less energy. But those are like some small things we can do. It's really important to remember that much larger actions by governments and corporations are needed to really fix climate change. So I just wanted to give you some examples of those larger initiatives in Minnesota. So the first example is the Solar on Schools Act. And this is an initiative that would establish a grant program to install solar panels on Minnesota schools. And it would save money and energy for schools, and it would allow them to give money to other important school programs that might be underfunded. In addition, students would be able to learn about solar panels and other types of renewable energy through these additions. And there are actually many schools in Minnesota that already use solar panels. Shown on the left is Chisago Lakes, and there's also Red Wing and Pine River. And I learned recently that St. Paul schools are considering adding solar panels to their schools as well. So solar panels are just one type of what is called renewable energy, which is what I'm talking about next. So why is renewable energy so important? Renewable energy doesn't pollute or create carbon emissions, which is very different from sources like gas or oil, which Indigo kind of talked about with line 3. So that means it's much better for the environment. Things like solar and wind and water can be used to create electricity for heat and light. And it supplies energy to thousands of people without hurting the planet. So Solar on Schools is just one of these opportunities to introduce renewable energy into our community, and hopefully it will play an even bigger part in the future. So next, I wanted to talk about some local youth activism in Minnesota. So there have been lots of examples of this local youth activism, and many of them are led by BIPOC and minority youth. So one is the Youth Climate Strike, and this was in 2019. There was a nationwide youth climate strike where students skipped school to protest government inaction on climate change. And in Minnesota, students all over the state participated. And in the Twin Cities specifically, students marched to the state capitol. And this was to kind of convince and put pressure on the Minnesota government to support more laws that would help the climate. So actions like this are really important for climate justice because they raise awareness about the issue, and they also put pressure on the government to act. So a second example is the Youth Climate Justice Summit, which is actually run by YA. And every year, students and young people from across Minnesota meet at the state capitol. You can see the group in the picture. We take part in workshops where we can learn about different climate justice issues. And we are also involved in lobbying directly to our legislators. So this year, even though it was online, we were still able to successfully learn and lobby together. So next, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about with local youth activism, and that is the Climate Justice Education Bill. And this bill was recently created by YA, and its goal was to require climate justice education in all Minnesota schools. And as an organization, we thought it was really important that students learn about the intersectionality with climate and social justice issues. And like Sophia, this is something I didn't learn about until I joined YA. So I think it's really important that students learn it too. And we did a lot of work trying to get the bill to pass through the Minnesota legislature. We talked to Congress people and we lobbied, but unfortunately it did not pass this year. But we will definitely be trying again in the future. So after all of this, you might be wondering, what can I do? So one easy thing you can learn is how to lobby. So what is lobbying? Lobbying is when you talk to your representatives in government about anything that you're passionate about, and you try to convince them to be on your side or support a bill or law. And you can ask them to support a law like the Climate Justice Education Bill or the Solar on Schools Act, or you could just ask them to do a better job on something like climate justice. So how can you lobby? All you need to do is call, email, or talk directly to your representatives. Usually they're happy to listen to you and it can make a real impact. One other thing you can do is join YA or some other organization. Everyone is welcome to join us, and you can find more information about us at climategen.org, or you can follow us on Instagram at @ya_climate. So these are just a few final discussion questions. You can comment these or just think about them. And they're, what does your ideal future look like? What is one thing you have learned? And what is one way that you might be able to get involved? So we just wanted to thank you so much for listening to us. And we have all hoped that you learned something new from this presentation.